Captain Jim Donovan is our main speaker today. He'll be doing the slideshow for us. And I have to read you some of his stuff that was in Eventbrite. Hopefully you got a chance to read this. It's really quite amusing. Quote. Upon enlistment in the Navy in July of 1973, 19-year-old Jim Donovan was captivated by a recruiter who sold him on the Ocean Systems Technician Analyst rating. He was assured of no sea duty and assignments to sun-drenched island duty locations, such as tropical beaches in places such as Bermuda and Hawaii. Seaman recruit Donovan was also led to believe that he would be performing oceanography for the purposes of oil exploration off the U.S. coast and the Gulf of Mexico. Instead, he recalled being taken behind locked, quote-unquote, green doors at a Navy facility in Key West, Florida, and learned that his new calling in life was to locate and track Soviet submarines. More than 3 decades later, Donovan retired at the rank of captain. As his career progressed, he gradually became a bigger cog in the U.S. Navy's integrated undersea surveillance system. Later in his career, he served as the commanding officer of the Naval Ocean Processing Facility of Dam Neck, Virginia. Today, Captain Donovan is fully retired and serves as a volunteer tour guide on board Battleship Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia. Sitting next to him is Captain Kathy Donovan, U.S. Navy retired. Captain Donovan served in the IUSS community from 1982 to 2003 in positions from watch officer to commanding officer of the Naval Ocean Processing Facility, Dam Neck, Virginia. She transitioned to the Information Dominance Community in 2001 and served in afloat and ashore commands as an information professional officer until her retirement in 2011. Upon retirement after serving 29 years in the Navy, Captain Donovan qualified as an emergency medical technician EMT and volunteers with the City of Virginia Beach EMS. I want to stop for a second, and I would like us to give a round of applause to Kathy for being an EMT. Protect and serve. She was a Woman of Distinction Military Category Awardee 2018 and the Hampton Roads Navy Flagship Still Serving Veteran of the Year in 2018. And next to Kathy is QTAC's SES Nick McConnell, U.S. Navy retired. Nick served in the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System for 21 years and retired as a Senior Navy Petty Officer in 1992. After working as a contractor with Hughes Aircraft Company for several years, Nick returned to government service and spent the next 16 years as a Senior Acoustic Intelligence Analyst at the Office of Naval Intelligence. Mr. McConnell fully retired in 2014. He is the Director, Integrated Undersea Surveillance Systems, Caesar Alumni Association. Thank you all. Let's turn to Jim.
I will point out that I did get to those Bermuda. Back. No, it's not on the screen. Okay, I'll just wait. Oh, so I'm not the only one. So I don't know, he called me a cog. What is a cog? And my name is Jim, and I'll give the presentation, and when I'm finished, if you could hold your questions, we'll sit down at the table, and Nick, Kathy, and I will field your questions and sort of take turns. We've got various experiences at different levels of SOSUS, or underwater surveillance community. But before I get started, I want to sort of get a pulse of the audience. When I was enlisted in the Navy, my rating was Ocean Systems Technician, an OT. Doesn't exist anymore. It ended after the Cold War. Those folks in the Navy now are called sonar technicians. There's a uniform of an enlisted Ocean Systems Technician, second class petty officer. Basically, the rating symbol was a trident, signifying the oceans. And I worked my way through that. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. Some of you, I'm probably the oldest person in the room, I guess, I'm 65. But I grew up in the 50s and 60s. And those of you that were around at that time may recall what was going on at the time. A lot of similarities to what we have happening today. We were in the height of the Cold War. It was building up. When I was in elementary school in Boston, Massachusetts, I would be doing things like hiding under my desk for something called a duck and cover drill. Remember that? There was even a black and white movie that they showed us, little elementary kids, school children, about ducking and hiding in the case of a nuclear explosion. But a futile attempt. It would have served no purpose under that desk if that went off. But I remember being terrified. Moving into junior high school and high school, I remember watching CBS Nightly News with Walter Cronkite. Remember those shows? I had a large family. We had a black and white television back then. And every night on the CBS Evening News, sort of towards the end, there would be two numbers at the top of the screen. There would be body counts of how many Vietnamese had died that day and how many American soldiers had died that day. And here I was, getting up to the age of 16, 17, 18, and I had to apply for the draft. I applied for the draft in my senior year of high school and before my birthday. And before I graduated from high school, they pulled a lottery. The last year of the lottery, my number was 144. 144 meant I would graduate, and the following summer, by July 31st, I would be inducted into the Army and perhaps in Vietnam by that time. I didn't want to do that. So I went down to the Navy recruiter, the Air Force recruiter, the Coast Guard, the Marines, anything but the Army. And I settled on the Navy. And he covered it, Jason covered it. They offered me this new rating called Ocean Systems Technician. Had been created in 1971. Told me that I would never go to sea. I would be on beautiful beaches and, perhaps there would be rum on the beaches and I'd find a young lady to marry for the rest of my life, but who knew? So that's what I did. I signed up for the late entry program. As luck would have it, the draft ended the following February. I wouldn't have gone anyway, but I had a contract with the Navy and I joined. I started in Key West, Florida for A school, the top year, and I went down there thinking that I was going to be doing oceanography. I went into that room and was briefed about the real mission of the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS community, as we'll refer to it from here on out. And I went on to my first duty station in Bermuda, and then the rest of it I'll talk about a little bit later. What I wanted to mention before I get to that point is the SOSUS mission. If I do this right. Today it's called the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, or IUSS. Back in the 50s and 60s and 1970s, it was referred to just as the SOSUS, or Sound Surveillance System. I'm loath to use acronyms in a group like this, but I have to tell you about three acronyms that will come up in my presentation. The first, as I mentioned, was the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, or IUSS. That's an umbrella program for undersea surveillance in the Navy. Underneath that, there were, during the Cold War, two types of sensor systems. One was called SOSUS, or Sound Surveillance System. That was a number of fixed bottom-mounted microphone or hydrophone arrays in the water connected by cable back to shore bases, listening for Russian submarines passively. No pinging, just listening passively for Russian submarines. The second piece of the IUSS is referred to as SURTAS, Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System. We got mobile in the 1980s and started to place hydrophone arrays, long ones, about 8,000 feet long, on the backs of merchant or civilian craft, ships, and towed them throughout the world's oceans and detected Russian submarines that way. It's changed today. I won't talk about that necessarily, but there are more pieces of the IUSS today than just those two. There are 4 or 5 more systems. Okay? So behind those green doors, they were green doors. Oh, before I get started, I was an ocean systems technician. I served in the social community. In the audience, how many folks served as an OT? How many people served in the IUSS community? Keep your hands up for those of you who have. Family members of those folks. Okay, there are several of you. Okay, these are the people that have come in for this. Some of these people I have worked for Dick, worked with Nick, and was supervisor over Heidi and other people here. Okay, but I may be a captain, but at home I say I always was the XO, the number 2. These are just neat pictures. So in 1991, the mission was declassified. All the way up until that period, from 1950 until 1991, the term SOSUS was even classified. The mission was highly classified. There were cover stories for what we were doing in that community, and basically I was told to say, if my family asked, that we were monitoring ocean currents, temperatures, salinity, the heights of waves in all of the world's oceans, to give that information to the Navy to use in their operations.
Is that what you told the merchant marines that were towing stuff behind them too? Is that
The merchant marines probably thought the same thing.
okay?
They probably thought, they weren't looking at the acoustic data. There were sailors that were doing that, actually Navy sailors that had clearances.
Navy people on those commercial vessels.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Initially there weren't, but they put military detachments on board those task ships at a later time. But here's the mission: to provide real-time surveillance and cueing of Russian submarines or Soviet submarines, from undersea sensors to warfare commanders and intelligence groups throughout the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and all of the world's oceans. Today it's also supporting Homeland Security and defense. So, sonar, or the ability to detect submarines, especially passively, can go all the way back to World War I. In 1920, something was discovered or invented called a sonic depth finder, where you could send a ping down to the bottom of the ocean, find out where you're located and how deep the water was below your ship. Sonic depth finder, 1920. It wasn't until the 1940s, World War II, and into 1950, when the ability to detect passive detections of Russian submarines for SOSUS would come to fruition. In 1937, a study was conducted at Lay University by a doctor named Maurice Fleming. Ewing. He had discovered what was determined to be a deep sound channel. He would take depth charges and drop them into the depths of the water, and then measure the sound transmission paths at various depths throughout the oceans. And he determined that in some parts of the ocean, at several thousand feet, the sound would travel in paths that would tend to refract or bend down as it approached the surface, and then the sound would tend to bend up as it got into the deeper waters of the oceans. Now, he didn't know what was causing that, but he suspected that there was a channel, which turned out to be a deep sound channel axis, that sound could travel for hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles, and still be detectable if you placed hydrophone arrays judiciously in those locations. He was right. A visual study was being conducted in the 1940s by MIT and Woods Hole Institute, and they were determining what was causing these refractions. Turns out what was causing these refractions at the surface was the temperature of the water was becoming warmer, and sound tended to bend down into the colder waters of the ocean. What was happening at the bottom, because they were using a bathymetric thermograph, that it was pressure in the deeper parts of the ocean that was causing those low frequency sounds to bend back up or reflect back up. So those Lay University experiments resulted at the end of World War II, in the mid to late 1940s, a SOFAR system, sound frequency and ranging. What would happen, those were used for downed pilots. A downed pilot would take his depth charge, if he's in the water, drop it into the water, it goes to the deep water, it blows up or explodes, and then hydrophones around the oceans could triangulate and locate that down pilot. Those are what's called SOFAR, sound fixing and ranging. After World War II, during the late 1940s into 1950, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army combined sources with this SOFAR experiment, and they deployed a network of SOFAR stations around the world's oceans for that use. Come 1950, the Navy determines that the Soviet submarine is the biggest threat to national security, and they formed a panel in 1950, in early 1950, at MIT, at Harvard. It was called the Hartwell experiment, the Hartwell project. And they started to discuss this ability to track Russian submarines or Soviet submarines. They used the information from the deep sound channel, couldn't talk about it because it was classified, and they came up with a project name, an unclassified code word called Project Jezebel. Project Jezebel was listening to the deep sound channel and looking to those experiments that were presented at the Hartwell experiment. That second study that was being conducted by MIT, looking at the reasons for those refractions, was called Project Michael. Project Jezebel and Project Michael, in 1950, the Hartwell experiment for discussion, were merged. Those two projects, Michael and Jezebel, later became known as Project Caesar. Project Caesar was the unclassified term for the SOSUS system in the 1950s and the 1960s up until recently, up until 1991. I'll go back to this. This is how it really works. They have a Russian submarine or a submarine emanating sound from any number of sources. Anything that rotates like a propeller blade, a propeller shaft, anything that fires like an engine, a motor, a pump, everything makes sound. It emanates through the submarine into the water, and if it's at a low frequency, below 500 hertz or so, it will get trapped in that deep sound channel and be detectable on these arrays. Each of these SOSUS arrays, the early SOSUS arrays, had 40 hydrophones in one array on average. They would be connected by a coaxial cable back to a shore facility. I have a piece of one of those coaxial cables here. The maximum range of these cables from these shore facilities at the time was up to less than 150 miles from shore. So a lot of these SOSUS arrays along the east and west coast were placed on the continental shelf, which is located in the area of the deep sound channel. So if you have arrays located up and down the east coast, they would have a look into that deep sound channel all the way across the Atlantic to Great Britain and to Europe, theoretically, if the sound was loud enough. And these sites were laid all over the place. The first test was conducted in 1952 at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and at Eleuthera, an island in the Bahamas. We sent a bunch of admirals down, or so I'm told. Several admirals went down to Eleuthera, and they got some U.S. submarines, diesel boats, to operate off the coast of Eleuthera where the array had been placed. They conducted 25-mile box tracks and were able to detect and track off of the SOSUS arrays from Eleuthera, the test array, that submarine throughout its test. They convinced the admirals immediately on the first day. They went back to Washington, D.C., and by the end of 6 months, or into the middle of 1950, they convinced the Navy to go for a SOSUS network up and down the U.S. East Coast in 1952. It was deployed in 1954, and 2 years later, it was deployed, the same thing, into the Pacific, up and down the west coast of the United States. Okay, this is one of the operations display rooms. After the information is transited back up that cable into an equipment building, this is what it looked like in one of those operations display rooms. I'll give you some samples of some of the low far-gram detections of these in a minute, but I just wanted to point this out. Each of the 40 hydrophones produced one piece of paper on an actuator. Oh, something changed on there. When you sat down, it was like that. It's good for the view. Sorry. So this right here is a sonar data recorder. It would take the information that's coming in, the signals or frequencies that are coming in, and through electric impulses onto electrosensitive paper, print a LOFAR-gram. This is a LOFAR-gram right here. Each of the 40 hydrophones produce paper displays, and there would be hundreds of these paper displays in the operations watch floor. 300, 400, even more than that at some of the larger facilities. Now, there are two things that are representative of what's happening in this display room. One of them was the sound. Sound sounds like a clicking sound of these actuator styluses going back and forth. I brought one with me today. This here is an actuator. Stand away for a minute. This is an actuator right here. It's from Keflavik, Iceland. This actuator was in use from 1966 until 1996. It still works. I happened to be there when they decommissioned the NAVFAC, and I took this home with me. Here are the two styluses that would go back and forth. At one point, we developed a vacuum system. That's what these tubes are for, because these styluses, when they burned that electrosensitive paper, think of an EKG back in the olden days, back in the former days, it produced carbon dioxide, or smells coming up. You didn't see smoke, but you certainly smelled it. It was basically black soot. When we left our watch floors in Bermuda, back in these days before these vacuum systems, if we blew our nose, the black soot would come out. It was like carbon, black carbon, ozone. I want to plug this in. We plug this in, let's see if it works. It's not that. So I don't know if you can hear that, but if you magnified that sound by hundreds of actuators, you can imagine the sound, the click, click, click sound. They're all going to be clicking in unison. Let me see if I can go around the back. Doesn't work. I think I need to get someone up here to put that in place for me. So that's the actuator. So two things are being produced continuously: carbon and a clicking sound. So our jobs as ocean systems technicians, which would walk up and down, literally walk, there were no computers, we walked up and down these beams looking for submarine contacts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These actuators at Keflavik, for example, were never turned off for 30 years. They produced these paper displays that ran up. Newest time at the bottom, what's happening now, oldest time at the top. Back in those days, this was about 2.5 hours worth of data, 3 hours worth of data, and then it rolled over the back. You can see this one here, the gram rolls over the back, and you have 24 hours worth of data on one piece of paper. The job of the ocean systems technician around the midnight time period on the midwatch was to cut this off here and then roll those paper rolls back up and store them for review the next day. You see the boxes of them underneath right here. Senior analysts at the time would go pull those boxes out the next morning and review everything to make sure nothing was missed, and that anything that was reported properly. Some of the tools of the trade, we marked every contact off, friendly and unfriendly, with a red pencil. Kept track of what the sources were, and then would write down numbers to keep track of who was who and who was supposed to be who and who might be who. And we use 10-point dividers to keep track of the frequencies.
Could you tell the difference between a friendly and a foe by just what the wiggles look like?
I'm going to show you some. It's hard, you can't see anything on here. By the way, much of what I'm going to tell you in our day was highly classified. And some of us are still shuddering at the thought of telling anyone what we did because of the threat of a $50,000 fine and 10 years in jail if we even mentioned it to anyone. But I did go over to the Commodore at the current headquarters and get this brief that I'm presenting, blessed to say it's unclassified. But we've closed the door and we've posted 2 armed Marines outside. I'm sorry I have to kill you at the end of the presentation. So here's a LOFAR-gram. This is one of the older ones back from the 1970s, 60s. There's nothing classified on this LOFAR-gram. This is an unclassified gram that I'm showing you now. I just wanted to show you what things we're looking at. What the operator here is looking for is something out of the ordinary or something that is a known threat frequency. Now a frequency goes from 0 all the way up into the spectrum. A frequency is referred to with a number or an acronym Hertz, 5 Hertz, 10 Hertz, 60 Hertz, 100 Hertz. It's a revolution. If anything that turns in revolutions per minute. And those revolutions provide a frequency. So for example, the United States uses 60 cycle or 60 Hertz power. If you have a generator, a turbine and a reduction gear and a generator on board a US vessel, it is going to provide 60 cycles of power and generate a 60 cycles frequency or signal. If that signal from that generator transmits into the water and gets into the SOSUS network, it's going to show up as a single line at 60 Hertz. Okay? Russians and other countries utilize 50 cycle power, and the opposite is true. Well, the same is true. Their electrical energy is going to produce a 50 cycle line, something at a different frequency. So there's a discriminator. The operators are looking for 50 and 60 frequency hertz. Okay, if it's a 50, it could be a threat. If it's a 60, it's a friendly. Right? We're looking from left to right. 0 hertz is down here, about 150 hertz is at the top. A very low frequency, or low frequency. These markings across the top, you can see them there, there. Those are 10 hertz or 10 cycle increments, from 10 all the way up to 150 right here. So frequency domain left to right, higher frequencies up here, lower frequencies down here. The up and down axis along here, these are time markings. This tells you what time it is. These darker marks indicate, am I still on? These darker marks indicate what the hour is. And here in this case, it's 5 o'clock. Could be 10 o'clock, could be 1800, could be different times. And these markings here indicate darker is 5-minute increments, and the lighter ones in the middle are 1 minute. So this is about 30 minutes of gram time, or 30 minutes of a signature of a contact or two. The newest time is at the bottom. It's 5:30 right now. Here's 5 o'clock at the top, and this paper, remember, goes continuously for 24 hours. We're looking from left to right. In this case, this is a merchant or a surface vessel. These darker lines, okay, let's just take you as an operator. The first thing the operator is doing is discriminating and eliminating things off of his mind to look at. Right away, all these dots and these gray spots all over the gram, that's ambient noise or sea noise in the ocean. It's irrelevant. They're not even looking at that. They're looking for patterns of lines with spacings, and they're looking for things that change, like right here. And that's what draws their attention. If you're a merchant vessel that is just transiting from New York to London, you're probably on a standard speed with a standard shaft RPM, standard engine speed, and the lines are going to be continuous all the way through. If you're a submarine, you're probably not on a straight path all the time. You're making maneuvers to clear your baffles, to look behind you to see if anyone's trailing you, and to go up for communications breaks, and slow down for changing and charging batteries. And that's what they're looking for, changes down here. In this case, there's a mark here, it's at 18 hertz or cycles. And there's another harmonic of it, and another, and another, and another. This is caused by, could be caused by an engine or a blade propeller. This one's caused by a propeller from a surface vessel that has 5 blades on its propeller shaft. And how do we know that? Inside the darker lines are smaller spacings. Right here is easiest to see. And there are 5 spaces in there indicating propeller shaft blades. What happens is a propeller is turning in the ocean. It's causing cavitation. It's causing air bubbles to pop. And that's causing the noise of the propeller blade. And if it's big enough or loud enough, it's also causing shaft noises. The closer you are to the surface, the more bubbles or cavitation will occur on the propeller shaft. If you're a submarine operating in the deep waters of the ocean, there's more pressure, less chance for cavitation. And mostly with those, you'll see just the blade rate and not the propeller shaft rate or the harmonics of that. So the acoustic analysts, they're looking for changes. See right away here, something is not the same as everything else. And all submarines of all nations are built typically the same way. Let's just say we have Russian or Soviet Yankee-class ballistic missile-carrying submarines, or Delta class, that's a better one. The Delta class Russian submarines, they built 47 of them from 1972 to 1992 and deployed them with 12 to 16 ballistic missiles targeted against the United States and other allied countries. All of those Deltas look the same acoustically. All have the same turbines, they have the same reduction gears, they have the same numbers of blades, they have the same numbers of shafts. Everything acoustically should look the same, but there were differences. In the 1970s and 80s, there were submarine commanders with the Russian Navy that would operate differently from other submarine commanders. In one case, for example, I mentioned that submarine will turn around periodically to check its baffles or what's behind to clear. Some of them just turned around one time slowly using their sonar to detect any enemy near them. Others would do an 8, go around twice just to see if there was anyone following them. There was 1 or 2 commanders, Russian commanders, that did something in the Atlantic, like they called him Crazy Ivan. And what Crazy Ivan would do, that commander of a Yankee-class submarine, he would make that turn, and then he would jam it at full speed and head directly into his baffles to see if anyone was going to run, if he would spook anyone. And U.S. submarine commanders probably know more about that than I do. But who's going to detect that high-speed burst? The SOSUS, because it was right there. And now in the 1950s and 60s, submarines were developing even faster paces. Khrushchev, in 1957, mentioned in the speech that the Russians, or the Soviet Union, was pumping out submarines like sausages. There were 235 what were called whiskey-class diesel boats back then, and then they were followed by Zulus and Foxtrots and Gulfs and other types of diesel boats. By 1960, there were 460 submarines in the Soviet Union. So SOSUS couldn't have come at a better time. One of those Yankees also had something, we gave them nicknames, the acoustic analysts did. One of those Yankees was called a furring Yankee, fur like on an animal, like on a cat, fur. It's called the furring Yankee because every time we detected him at certain speeds, we noticed that he had a pattern of like fur over the acoustic signature, similar to something like this. We don't know what caused that fur display on what would normally be a straight line like this, a single line, but it was suspected that some of the anechoic coating tiles, sound isolation tiles that were glued or cemented to the sides of the submarine had come loose. And at certain speeds, they would start to flap or bang against the hull or sing as the submarine went through the waters. The submarine didn't know it, but we certainly did. So we had names for all of these. It's called a signature of a submarine. Of course, we took off the time marks, the frequency marks. We have no idea what the frequency is. What is classified today about the SOSUS network is our techniques and methods. I can't tell you, and I can't remember at my age, the reduction ratios and certain frequencies that we were trained to look for. Occasionally, they do come up when I'm watching Powerball and other numbers. And here's another submarine contact. This is an enemy submarine contact. I don't know what kind. Some of you guys know, I'm sure, but we won't talk about that here. But the signature here, the signature here of interest is right here. It's a one harmonic of a laser, and there's another harmonic right here. And you'll notice that there are two lines that seem to be doing the same thing together in each of these patterns. We call them doublets or two shafts. A lot of submarines, most submarines have at least two shafts. Some have one. And this submarine is making maneuvers all the way through. Again, current time, oldest time at the top. Other things that the acoustic analyst was trained to do, and it took years to train to do this, and on average, I would think that about the 8 to 12 year mark is what it took to really become an expert analyst in this field. These were the first class and the chief petty officers in the rating. There were a lot of younger guys that like to say that they found their submarines on the first day on watch, but it really did take some training and some expertise in order to find a submarine. Another thing that we could track here would be marine mammals. They're in the ocean and they make noises, especially whales that make large, low-frequency noises and songs. And we did detect those as well. There are none here, no whale detections, but they would be signified by little blips and blurps like this around the lower frequency of the spectrum. So the Hartwell experiment ended up with Eleuthera being a test platform. They loved it. They said, let's go for it. They built a series of these old NAVFACs, naval facilities, up and down the U.S. East Coast, starting in 1954. And this is Raimi, Puerto Rico. This is the first NAVFAC that was built in 1954, 65 years ago, this coming September. And in September, the IUSS community, or the SOSUS community, will host a celebration and reunion and anniversary for the 65th in Norfolk, Virginia. We'll talk more about that later if anyone's interested. This picture comes from 1968. Several years after the NAVFAC was built, they had added a lot to it. The original NAVFACs at places like Cape May, New Jersey, and Rainy, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda and other places had small Quonset huts like this, right here. All this other stuff was built later. So they would have Quonset huts like this, and there would have been another larger Quonset hut here. It was upgraded to a permanent structure in 1968. In the Quonset hut, one would hold the operations building where the paper displays were. Another Quonset hut would hold the emergency power generation system in case they lost base power or electrical power. And then the other Quonset huts would be a place for barracks, places for people to live. Back then, it was initially only men that served in the SOSUS community in the 60s and into the 70s. In the 70s, they started to assign women and men to these facilities. But again, this is Rainy, Puerto Rico. The cable's coming in from the ocean. It goes into the operations equipment building where the information is displayed. There's a communications facility inside co-located, and that information is forwarded to the appropriate commanders and evaluation centers.
Was the data target quality where you could hand whatever the analyst saw to somebody and they could directly shoot a missile to kill the target?
So IUSS or SOSUS provides what's called queuing data.
Okay.
We have no capability to weaponize the SOSUS or the IUSS. So think about this. You have an array looking off into the ocean in 2 to 5 degree arcs or segments, depending on which hydrophone is seeing the contact. You don't know how far away it is. It could be 5,000 miles away. It could be 5 miles away. If other information is required to actually pinpoint, localize that, perhaps 2 arrays can triangulate. And over time, you can start to reduce that probability area down to something manageable. We provided queuing to maritime patrol aircraft, submarines, and surface ships. in order for them to go in and pinpoint, localize, and they have weapons to drop on target. Okay. I'd like to say our information was pinpoint location data, certainly in Iceland. Okay, this is what it looked like at the height of part of the height of the Cold War in the 1970s. Old technology, coaxial cables out to 150 miles away, and terminated to shore facilities. They were located, these facilities, up and down the U.S. East Coast, Bermuda, Shelburne, Nova Scotia, Argentia, Newfoundland, and eventually Keflavik, Iceland in 1966, and Roddy, Wales in 1974. That was the East Coast. Now, a lot of these facilities in the Atlantic came from what was called the Lend-Lease Act. Does anyone remember hearing about the Lend-Lease Act of World War II? We traded 50 old, still working destroyers to Great Britain for use, part of the, we'll give you that, you give us use of some of your bases around your colonies. That's where we got Argentia, Newfoundland, Bermuda, and several of the Caribbean facilities like Barbados and Aruba. That's a pretty neat picture. Two type commanders, one in the Pacific in Hawaii, one in the Atlantic in Norfolk, Virginia, and 3,500 people operating the system. Very close.
Lease Act, did they know then that they wanted to set up SOSAs? Or did they just say, well, eventually we'll figure out something we want to do with that?
They figured out eventually we'll do it, but they did use those bases for other things. For example, Argentia, Newfoundland was a base long before SOSAs got there.
Okay.
This is the NATFAC at Keflavik, Iceland, and I put that in there because I always talk about Keflavik, Iceland. That's my favorite NATFAC. I did 3 tours of duty in Iceland, and several other people that are here went there as well. I don't know when this is from. I would think this is from the 1970s. The cable is out here going into the water, into the Norwegian Sea. It's coming back here into the back of the terminal equipment building, built in 1966. The captain and the executive officer of the administrative building is right here. There's a security fence built all the way around, a double security fence, all the way around the NATFAC. This is probably the 80s, something. Yeah. And it used to be you could park right out in front of the admin building. And it was very highly classified. Notice that there are no windows. It was about 6 miles, 7 miles off the main base in Keflavik, Iceland. Not a very attractive place, and it certainly wasn't one of the beaches that I signed up for in 1973. So just to recap a little bit what we've talked about so far, 1950, early, January 1950, Project Hartwell studies long-range detection at Harvard. It results in a system in 1954 with NATFAC Rainy, Puerto Rico being the first one, and growing by 1974 to 22 facilities. 1962 happens, and that's a watershed moment for the SOSAS community. This is where the Navy finally accepted us. From 1952 until 1962, we had not detected any submarines. Wow. At least not any Soviet submarines that we were aware of. So what happens then, NATFAC Cape Hatteras off the coast of North Carolina detects the first ever Soviet diesel submarine by SOSAS. Now that was great, but that didn't get reported immediately. It was something that was there. A submarine was found later by an aircraft, and they went back to look at the array, paper displays, and found the submarine contact because the SOSAS operators did not recognize it at the time. In July of the same year, 1 month later, NATFAC Barbados in the Bahamas detects the first Soviet nuclear submarine. Now remember, these SOSAS networks were designed to detect snorkeling diesel submarines. When the diesel submarine is submerged, they're on battery, they're not possible unless you're right on top of them to be detectable. Only when they're surface, charging their engines and transiting on the surface or snorkel mode. It turns out the Soviet nuclear submarines are even more detectable at greater ranges than the diesel submarines, and the nuclear submarines are always submerged. Now, this detection by Barbados was on a November-class fast attack submarine, one of the earlier ones in the Soviet Union, all the way up into the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap off the coast of Norway. And that's quite a phenomenal detection. And Barbados also detected the USS Nautilus, but that was a known track, and they tracked her across the Atlantic Ocean at great ranges. You talked about 1963, but the 1963, the Thresher. So people often ask us, did you detect the Thresher? Did you see anything? Yes, we did detect Thresher and Scorpion detections, but not so much detecting blade rates and pumps and motors. What we were able to detect was the explosion. The explosion of a submarine is quite unique. What first happens is the submarine sinks into the depths of the water with a great pressure, and the first thing that happens is an implosion, and then an explosion of what's going to blow, whatever's explodable. So it's an implosion followed by an explosion. We did detect those, but of course we were cued that there was a missing submarine. We went back to look, and we were able to detect those things and help the localizers for the Scorpion locate the Scorpion. Thresher was known exactly where she was. And more. So by 1970, we moved up now, it's quite phenomenal what we're doing with these SOSUS arrays. We introduced women into the rating, and we realized that we couldn't just have anyone in the system doing these types of jobs. You couldn't come in for one assignment and learn to do this. I know my first supervisor at Bermuda was a guy named Leo Lara. He's first-class petty officer. Remember Lara? Leo Lara had been a cook or a steward in the Navy. He worked for one of the CNOs. He rose to high ranks, and they got rid of that rating. It was no longer a steward rating in the Navy. He was Filipino. They gave him a security clearance, and they sent him to Bermuda, and he was my supervisor. He really hadn't done this before, but he was good at leading people. So we had all kinds of people doing this job. The Navy said, stop, we need to solidify and create our own rating to keep people in this closed community, to keep regurgitating them through the system. And that's where the Ocean Systems Technician rating came from.
Does it surprise you that this was never computerized in the 70s and 80s, but required human beings to actually look for these signals?
It was computerized in the 1980s, and I'll get to that.
Okay.
And it was started in the 1970s, but that was archaic computer systems, things that didn't really work and do much for us. So Russian submarines up until the 70s, late 70s, early 80s were 30 decibels noisier than their counterparts in the United States submarine force. They were very easy to track. We tracked them all over the ocean. We were able to keep track of every deployed Russian submarine in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Norwegian Sea, Mediterranean, at any time up until that period. Then something happened. A young man that you may have heard of, I'm sure you have, and not so young anymore, John Walker. Turns out from 1968 up until 1980s, he was giving the Russians a lot of code information. They were able to decipher messages and determine, they were able to learn about the SOSUS network. So starting, even before he was captured, starting in the 1970s, even though they were late getting to the game, they started to quiet their submarines. And by the 1980 period, 1981, 82, they were almost on par with US submarines, and they were very difficult for us to track with those SOSUS arrays. At least their nuclear submarines were difficult to track. And they knew somewhat of our locations, and they would avoid them as well. They would track in different areas. So we developed a mobile system. If the submarines aren't going to come to our arrays and be detected, we're going to send those arrays to the submarine areas where they are hiding. And we developed the SORTAS, Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System. It initially used these single hull designs that were civilian manned crews that towed an 8,000-foot cable up the back of the ship and had acoustic data that could be processed here, but it was sent by satellite up and back to a shore facility where those expert analysts could analyze and do that. This was the Prevail. and this is how it worked. Those single monohull designs were later replaced by swath or twin hull designs that could withstand higher sea states and operated extremely northern waters in the Norwegian Sea and in the northern Pacific as well. There's the Impeccable, that's one that's still in existence. So the submarines are hiding from all those SOSUS arrays that have limited detection capability when the sounds start to become less detectable. So we will just bring that array right to where the submarine is. Hopefully he doesn't know that and he can't avoid it. And they transmit that data back to the Naval Ocean Processing Facility, which was another naval facility. Instead of a NAVFAC, they called that an OPF. The Naval Ocean Processing Facilities had the capability to monitor shore-task ships, and they had their own SOSUS arrays as well. The facility that Kathy and I are familiar with is at Dam Neck in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and it was commissioned in 1984, and the 1979, I think. Yeah, 1979, but the SORTAS ships went in there in the 1980s. They had their SOSUS arrays after consolidation. They had more of those Atlantic arrays those smaller Quonset hut buildings were shut down and the arrays were re-terminated to Dam Neck, Virginia. And that's what we will be familiar with. During my tour and Kathy's tour in the late 1980s, early 1990s, no, late 1990s, we put military detachments on board the SORTAS ship who could acoustically discriminate and find submarine contacts and report them themselves. Well, we still got the data back to the NOV, but those technicians on board the ship could immediately report that data to the operating forces that were out there, to the P3s, to the submarines, and to the warfare commanders. I mentioned the Soviet Delta-class submarines, so we're up into like the 70s and 90s. There were 47, the most of one class of ballistic missile submarines that the Soviets ever built. 47 were built in 20 years, 72 to 92. The first one that was detected by SOSUS was in 1974 at Keflavik, Iceland, on its way to deployment. Initially what happened, the primary ballistic missile targeting platform by Russia against the United States was the Yankee-class submarines. And they had two located off the U.S. East Coast on patrol and two operating off the Pacific West Coast in the water. The Deltas would operate in the extreme northern latitudes of both oceans, closer to their home ports and away from the SOSUS network. And occasionally they would track into the SOSUS window into like the Norwegian Sea areas where they could be detected. It wasn't until the 1980s, late 80s, that they started to move further south and into the North Atlantic through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. Because there had 12 or 16 missiles. There were 4 variants of the Delta class, Delta 1 through Delta 4. The earlier ones had 12 missiles. The older one, or the newer ones at the end had 16 missiles and greater capability. So there's the rating was established in 1970. I came into the system in 1973. We detect that first Delta class. And then a SOSUS modernization program begins. And what the modernization program meant in 1975 was that we're going to start taking those 22 facilities with multiple arrays and start to consolidate it down to fewer facilities because technology had improved. Satellite communications had improved. Cables could go from 150 miles, instead of that restriction, they could go out thousands of miles and use repeaters to get the information back to shore. So we could have 1 or 2 or 3 facilities with arrays anywhere in the world, in the oceans. Start to consolidate it. 1976, I was involved with this particular contact. NAVFAC Bermuda, I was on an array, I wonder if I can say this. Each of the arrays had numbers, and I don't know if we can even talk about that anymore, but they also had unclassified names in case we had to call the captain in from home at night. Instead of saying, I have a contact you need to see on array X, Y, or Z, I would say, some had baseball teams. In Bermuda, they were Dog, Easy, Easy 1, and Easy 2. And there were 4 arrays at Bermuda. Those were the unclassified names. The first 2, Dog and Easy, looked west towards the United States. The other two looked east, out into the ocean where the Yankees were. I was on one of those arrays looking into the North Atlantic, or to the east coast of the United States. And lots of U.S. submarines would be detected. We reported many of them. They're operating in their home waters. They don't care if we detect them or not. We reported one. Its ratio of its blade and its turbine didn't really fit, but we reported it and it was evaluated as a friendly submarine. The next day, the submarine force in the Atlantic said, there's no U.S. submarine in that position. You've got to go back and look at it. And the people in the analysis division went back and looked, and it turned out it was a Russian Victor III class operating with less than 100 miles off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, back in the day, those days, if you had a Russian submarine contact and on SOSUS, he would get a designator starting with an M, or Mike as a designator, and we would keep numbers of them all through the year, Mike 1, Mike 2, Mike whatever. And that's how we kept track of it. A U.S. submarine would be given a F, or Foxtrot, friendly, F1, F2, F3, all the way up. This particular contact was given something called an X-ray, or an X, because it was even higher classified than what we were aware of in the SOSUS network. No one knew how he had gotten there or why he was operating so close to the United States. Interesting time. TOPSY is an acronym in the Atlantic. There's a similar one in the Pacific, where there was. TOPSY is a method of determining where the Yankee-class submarines were on patrol and where they were transiting. Most of our SOSUS networks were doing something called general surveillance. We're looking at the entire ocean for anything that's anywhere in the ocean. But realistically, we knew that submarines who were on patrol areas have to get to and from, and Russia's here and we're here, go only this area, not this area down here. And that was called searchlight surveillance. What happened in the 70s and into the 80s when these Yankees were on patrol in the Atlantic, and TOPSY, I think, stood for Transiting Soviet Yankee. I forget what those words were. I don't know. Whatever. Transiting operators for Soviet Yankee submarines. 5 Yankee submarines it took to cover the U.S. East Coast. 2 were on patrol and 3 were transiting. 2 were on station for however long their deployment was. One's heading home, one's heading south, and one's just about to leave port. So we knew where to look all the time, and we would set our eyes on those areas where to look. In 1985, the Stalwart was her first deployment, and she was terminated, or information came back to Dam Neck, Virginia. John Walker arrested, and Soviet Yankee class, there was a Yankee that sank off the coast, East Coast in 1986, and a Mike fast attack submarine sank in the northern Norwegian Sea in 1989. And finally, in 1991, we declassified the mission, and I can talk to you today, 20 years later. So this would look like by the 1980s after consolidation, down to just a few facilities. A main evaluation center in Norfolk, Virginia, one in the Pacific, on Ford Island in Hawaii, Adak, Alaska, Midway Island, a couple of facilities on the Atlantic, on the coast left, and the Atlantic's down to just a few. 14 surtask ships, however, were added. We cut the number of facilities in half, but the number of people went up to 4,000 people operating the system. Height of the Cold War. So where are we today? So 1997, 1998, we're down to just 2 facilities, Atlantic and the Pacific, 1 headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia. The one in Dam Neck, Virginia is the Atlantic hub, and the one in the Pacific is at Whidbey Island in Washington State, and that's really about it. We have surtask ships. Today, most of them are operating in the Pacific, if not all of them, and things are starting to change. In 2000 or so, we really had no mission left in the IUSS community. The Russians had lost the Cold War. They were staying home. They weren't deploying their submarines. China was not a threat yet. And we were doing things with this network like tracking marine mammals. And we were tracking and detecting drift net fishing, illegal drift net fishing, because we had sensors in those areas. And we're worried about it. So when the Navy starts to cut money and funding and manpower, who do they go after? People that aren't contributing to the war effort or to the mission. Well, things have changed. As you know, in recent years, things have changed. This is the NOPF at Dam Neck, Virginia. When she was commissioned in 1979, it consisted of this facility over here. 2 stories. Most of the administrative and maintenance equipment is in the bottom, and all the operations displays and offices are in the top floor here. There's a satellite antenna out in the back that sends information back and forth. This year, January 24th of 2019, they commissioned this new addition to the building. The square footage of this particular building is larger than the square footage of this particular building, but it's attached. It's like an annex building. And it's the new high-tech operations watch center. The first floor consists of offices and electronic equipment spaces. The entire second floor is an operations display room or watch floor. I've been to it. It's all computerized. There's no paper displays any longer. All of the SOSUS arrays in the Atlantic are terminated here. All of the SURTAS ships in the Pacific are terminated here and with the island. And today the IUSS consists of more than just SOSUS and SURTAS. There are many other systems now that comprise the IUSS. One of them is called DRAPES. The Navy's also using unmanned underwater vehicles to detect submarines and feed data back to the NOPFs. So this section here is an all-source undersea warfare intelligence collection facility for the Navy and for Great Britain. The NOPF Dam Neck is co-manned by British and US sailors. I guess sailors for the British. And that's what it looks like today. I've got to read you 2 things though. Because my mind can't memorize everything. So I gave the same presentation or something similar, and I think there's someone here who was at it. In 2015 at the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C., and I was with a guy, well, I should know him, a guy, he was an admiral, Admiral Tom Brooks. He was the Director of Naval Intelligence before he retired. And we were on a panel, 3 of us. Admiral Brooks, Captain Manthorpe, and then myself, a P3 guy and myself. And I remember when Admiral Bill spoke about the SOSUS network, and I wrote down, or they transcribed his words for me, and he said, of all the intelligence inputs that we had during the Cold War with respect to fusion of all source intel and exploitation of Soviet submarine locations during the Cold War, we had ELINT or electronics intelligence, he had signals intelligence, he had human intelligence, SOSUS, SURTAS, P3 Orion, beer's ready, P3 Orion aircraft. He said it was always SOSUS who tipped us in the intelligence community in the P3s first. And then he said, I want to add for emphasis, the SOSUS tipped us, it wasn't the other way around. We did add other things and tipped the P3s as well. And once in a while, we thought we tipped the SOSUS, but for the most part, it was the other way around. But when first suggested, it's now 69 years ago, when it was first suggested that we could use these passive sonar underneath the water to detect Russian submarines, it was really somewhat of a phenomenal concept. And the ability to get that manpower and that technology deployed in such rapid order so early in the Cold War was a phenomenal feat, and probably was part of the reason that we were able to win the Cold War. And that was confirmed in September of 1991 when the Undersecretary of the Navy came to Keflavik, Iceland, and spoke to the people at the NAVFAC. Keflavik, Iceland was known as the ASW capital of the world because of the location of the transit lanes out of Russia. And they sent the Undersecretary of the Navy up there to give us an award, a meritorious unit commendation to the facility, not just for the men and women who were working there that day, but for everyone who served in the SOSUS network. And part of that presentation, he said that the Cold War is over and you won it. It was a war that lasted 40 years, and during that time, you men and women were on the front lines. Through outstanding anti-submarine warfare capabilities and the personal resolve of the sailors to know where every Soviet submarine was, then and today, we're always a step ahead of them, and rest assured, the Russians knew that. We won the Cold War. So in closing, I think it's only fitting that the SOSUS community and the SOSUS story be recorded here at the Cold War Museum as part of the history of the Cold War. And I'm working with Jason to bring some of these artifacts back with me for display here at the Cold War Museum. And as a subscript or a postscript, I eventually did find that beach. Eventually did find that pretty girl, but it wasn't on the beach. It was in an operations watch floor in Keflavik, Iceland. And there was not a palm tree in sight, nor a bottle of rum. But I found her, and that's Kathy.
So now we do have time for Q&A. Because we are filming, I ask you to wait till you get the microphone before you give your question. You just raise your hand and we'll try to do it in rough order.
Historically, can you talk a little bit about how the pieces come together? I understand if you're focusing in on tracking a submarine, that's what you're focusing on. But how does that connect to the bigger picture? If there's a concern in regards to escalation from that perspective, where does all this data single to a single point to say one submarine multiplies by 10, by 20, or some aspect? How are you going to take those out in regards to targets? If there's anything you can describe from that perspective. I understand tracking all the individual targets, but if something is going to escalate into something that would be a disaster, how would the SOSUS system assist with that in regards to the next, to the domino effect, I guess, in regards to that process, if that makes sense?
So that elevates up in the chain of command. So we are the cure, as I mentioned, and then it goes up to a fusion center in the Atlantic, perhaps, up to the Pentagon, goes up to the National Security Council. So we have pictures and windows into it, but how it escalates is beyond our capability.
So you don't know if you're looking at something that's leading to something, you'll never know. You're just tracking, and from that perspective, nothing represents something that this is a potential threat at this point in regards to that data.
No, and if we detect something or we're asked to look in a certain area, we would be warned to look in that area, but not always know the reason for that.
I actually have really a couple of questions. You know, in 1985, two things happened. Number one, CERTAS was initiated. Number two, Walker was arrested for surveillance. To your knowledge, did Walker give the Soviets notice of a CERTAS system? And also, did the Soviets also initiate something comparable to the integrated underwater surveillance system that we employ to do anti-submarine warfare surveillance?
CERTAS didn't stay secret that long. Unfortunately, we drove too close to Russian submarines on many occasions, and we ended up snagging some of them. So CERTAS was hard to keep secret. But what was the second part of that? Oh, the Russian SOSUS? Yeah, I don't know if we ever figured out if Walker ever gave up CERTAS. I don't know. It definitely did compromise SOSUS.
If the Soviets have something comparable to the IUSS in terms of locating our submarines.
Yes, they do.
Was there similar systems available in like in the Baltic and the Mediterranean where there were also Soviet subs operating, or was this other means used to detect them?
We had big systems around the world, special project sites that we probably won't talk about. Some of them still exist. Many of them have been shut down. They're old equipment, but some stuff still exists today that most of us are not even ready to anymore, or none of us are ready.
So generally, if it's an ally or a member of NATO that is along the coast of an ocean or body of water, there's probably an agreement with them. But I think there's one at Dam there still.
Hello, I've got an article here in my hand from February 14th, 2018 by Carlos Munoz of the Washington Times, talking about how new Russian submarine tactics are threatening to overwhelm aging U.S. fleet. And I see you shaking your head and you're familiar with this particular thing. In it, they mention the fear that the Russians would be cutting the SOSUS cables and send teams down by a submarine to cut them and impair our ability to detect their movements. So, could you comment on that?
Let me just comment and turn it over to them. You're absolutely right, and as far back as I can remember, Russians were tinkering with the SOSUS cables and other cables, communications cables, for example, in the bottoms of the ocean. There is new technology available that you do not have to have an electric wire to transmit. There is a system that is being developed or has been developed underwater that uses water as a medium. The actual physical medium is water, and you basically can have a Wi-Fi network of SOSUS arrays or other sensors deployed throughout the world's oceans without a cable to be cut.
So you talked about how it took 8 to 12 years for someone to develop the skill set to read these grams. There's about 1,000 people that are part of the system now, according in 2019. I know that the OT rating changed, the officer corps was, kind of disbanded, so to speak, or came into a different community, and you all were superstars in that community too. Where do we get that talent, and how are we developing that talent now to do what we need to do today? Do we push that to another rating? Does the seashore rotation help with that? How are we keeping our expertise going?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest problem we have today. In all the years that Kathy and Jim and I were in the system, it was a closed loop system. So if you were an OT, you just went from NAVFAC to NAVFAC to NAVFAC to NAVFAC. Unlike submariners and surface folks who got to look at submarine contacts once in a blue moon, OTs looked at them every day. And we trained every day, so we got very good at it. Since the OT rate was disestablished in the mid-90s, the sonar technicians that now man and AWs that man SOSUS today are not closed-looped in a lot of cases. So they do a NOPF tour, that Kathy and Jim were CEO of, and then they go right back out to the fleet in a lot of cases. So the quality drain is in full force, and it's a huge problem. As most of you know, if you have a military background, for some strange reason, and I think it's just completely wrong, the military always cuts training money before anything else. And we have a hell of a problem. We have a hell of a problem manning the sites with quality people. We have a hell of a problem manning the Office of Naval Intelligence that does all the in-depth analysis, which writes the pubs and looking at new submarine contacts and trying to teach people how to find them. And even O&I everybody's losing people and nobody's training them. So it's a huge problem.
So with that naval ocean processing facility, that new facility, the headquarters has done over the last 10 years or so is to get back some of those former OTs who have gotten out of the Navy, either retired or separated, and they brought them back as civil servants. And there's a cadre at the NOPF at Dam Neck of about 25 of them or more probably now that were acoustic analysts for years, and now they're doing that, and they're like GS 9 through 12, I think the pay grades are, and they're doing the work with the sailors. Because everything, remember, is in one facility now. Atlantic and Pacific can be looked at. So you may have active duty sonar techs with 4 years in the Navy that are on watch, but someone's looking over their shoulders. I'll mention one name. His name is Master Chief, retired, Ed Smokey Smock. Ed Smock was an OT who served at one of the first NAVFACs in 1960. And he is still serving on active service, but as a contractor, still looking at low-far grams every morning at an OPF Dam Neck at 85 years of age. He might even be older than that. Wow. But he's still doing the mission, and he's still training the new guys. So there are ways that we're trying to get that talent back in and capture it.
So I'm Vladimir Putin. I don't want to kick you in the balls. All you gotta do is look on Google Earth, look at Dam Neck, find out where the generator pipes are for your backup diesel generator, cause an IW attack for the Norfolk Power, let the power go down, and send one of my boys off with emery grit to put in your diesel generator. You've consolidated everything in Dam Neck. Now, how hard is this for Vladimir and his boys? Why would we do that? Where's the backup? Where's the backup?
Where's the backup?
One? Only one? Yeah. I hope you're right.
There's a limit to what can be said there. Okay.
Jason? Over here.
Hi, so you talked about tipping and queuing with other SIGINT and ELINT systems during the Cold War, and please don't talk about anything you can't talk about. But I know there's another Cold War Navy system called Classic Wizard that's been decommissioned. Can you talk about that kind of interaction for the group here?
No, probably, I'm familiar with that, and I would say that's another piece of the fusion queuing going into the same fusion center. We did work with the, familiar with elephant cage transmissions? We did work with them as well.
Okay.
And we're co-located around the world with those same facilities.
All right.
They were tracking HF signaling or burst transmissions, but that didn't provide very much. They just knew along this line of bearing is a submarine. Every day he comes up and they. So for the Cold War, for the Cuban Missile Crisis, they knew that some number of submarines were heading south from Russia. They didn't know how many or what kind, or exactly where they were, but there were these lines across the ocean coming down. It wasn't until they got to off Cuba that SOSA started to triangulate them and say they were foxtrots. So but we don't do the communications with them.
You know, it's interesting to think about. We didn't have even top secret clearances in those days. We were all secret cleared. So when you talk about Classic Wizard, if you were co-located at a place where they had Classic Wizard, you'd hear the term. But we weren't involved in HFDF. Yeah, other people did that above us. You know, we swear to God, we never knew where even our own fleet was. We had a better idea where the Soviet fleet was than our own submarines. We were not cleared for that data. Very compartmented, and so, you know, our job simply was look at the LOFAR grams and figure out what's on there, tell the type commander, and then whatever happened with that information was above most of us. Yeah.
Did we have SOSUS monitored nodes embedded in the Mediterranean during the height of the Cold War? And if we did, what were the shore base, where were the shore base monitoring stations located? I didn't see any reference on your charts to Mediterranean during the height of the Cold War, the Sixth Fleet had at least 40 Navy ships running around the Med in 2 task groups. And there was a lot of Soviet submarine activity in the Mediterranean in that era.
So we were very good at their transit paths. So prior to them entering the Mediterranean, we normally had P3s, back in the day, S3s. You would have a task ship, part of the battle groups. So once they entered the Med, we knew exactly when they were entering the Med. And then the battle group commanders would maintain surveillance of them until they exited the Med and we picked them back up. So it was a good handoff system.
But there was no monitoring stations located physically in the Mediterranean.
It was just the battle group commanders with the task ships or the surtask ships, if you put them in there.
Is the Mediterranean deep enough for deep sound channels to detect it?
Folks, if, can I ask you to hold the questions until we get the mic around? You want to
So
continue?
just
The question was the Mediterranean deep enough for the deep sound channel? And again, at the point that I'm aware of, most of that was close aboard tracking. So the S3s, the P3s, the task ships would just maintain them. And again, back then, they were loud enough, the Charlies and the Victors, to
So
readily.
to answer your question, the pictures that I showed of the secret naval facilities along the east, on the Atlantic and Pacific, that's the only ones that we had. We did not have the NAVFACs in the Mediterranean or the Black Sea or the Baltic, but we did have sensors. The U.S. Navy did have sensors, but that's not part of the SOCIS community. In fact, we've had detections by SOCIS right up into the Straits of Gibraltar. But once they're in the Med, that's other sensors and systems. Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about the quality control aspect of the inspections and post-analysis? I've often wondered about that in my exposure to SOCIS in the late 60s, early 70s. What did you all do with the results from the inspections, and how interactive were you in terms of getting the kind of product out of the system that you were looking for?
We didn't like them. They were called operational readiness inspections, and we hated them.
And we were very competitive from one another, from the different facilities.
But I don't know. What do you want to talk about that? What did we do with the inspections and results?
Well, just like any inspection for a submarine, for a surface ship, or a P3 squadron, everybody had to go through those inspections. And obviously, no commanding officer wanted to have an inspection failure on their record. So we trained a lot. Now, we went through a period in the 70s where the Soviets weren't deploying much. Before the Yankee class came out, SOCIS really wasn't doing a lot. Once the Yankees started deploying routinely, we got a lot more data. But we went through a real quiet period, and the equipment was getting older. We weren't detecting many submarines, so there wasn't a lot of interest. And we weren't training well at all. When Jim and I first came in, the training system was not good. A guy by the name of Master Chief George Widener was responsible for changing all that in Iceland in the mid to late 70s. And Jim and I were products of that. Things got much better after that.
Were you all part of the inspection teams at any given time?
I never did a staff tour. I just stayed away from staff.
I did several.
Were there surprises that you encountered from what you believe to be the standard operating procedure?
There were, especially when we started to computerize the system. I was at the headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, and in one case, there was an allegation. Our goal was to find and report contact on a Russian submarine in less than 10 minutes. And you wanted your average to be lower than 60 minutes. And some of this analysis takes hours and if not days. So that was the goal. Well, at the facility at Blythe, Wales, there were allegations that they were cheating the system and changing the numbers. So I was dispatched with 2 chief petty officers because I was an officer by then. I couldn't do it myself. And we went to Blythe to inspect the facility and see what they were doing. And we never found that they were doing anything wrong. But the allegations were that they were going into these new things called computers and resetting the clock back to make it look like it was 10 minutes, not 10 hours. But they had fixed everything before we got there. Yes, they went back in and changed it back.
I have a question about the diesel submarines and the difficulty in detecting them, and especially now that they're armed with cruise missiles that they can launch. I'm talking about the Iranians, North Koreans, and of course the North Koreans are playing with ICBM capable sub-launching vehicles. So I'm just wondering what kind of a challenge are they?
The Iranians, not much, just because of their ability to, well, back in the day, when I deployed to the Gulf, Iranians always stayed on the surface, very rarely submerged, so it was very easy to keep track of them at all times. So, not sure of the current state of North Korea or Iran.
So there are new systems to combat that as well. We talked about inline arrays, the SOSUS arrays laid out, looking long range. We've talked about towed arrays being towed. Those are also linear arrays looking out directly. The newer arrays are vertically mounted. So there's their anchor at the bottom, and the arrays go up vertically, looking all around that area. So that's a smaller killing field area. And they can be deployed anywhere, especially if you have that wireless network that I talked about. You throw 100 of them in the water, and where those diesels are operating, you hopefully can help combat that.
I'm sorry, I think about these things like an Air Force guy with the fight between passive sensors and active sensors and trying to provoke your enemy into using his active sensors so you can find him and kill him. So I'm wondering if that is ever employed here, as much as you guys are passive sensors, but if a Soviet submarine could be provoked into using its onboard active sonar, was that a signal that you could detect them and pinpoint the location of a Soviet submarine because you provoked him to find out if there was something nearby that he needed to know about? Was sonar something that you could pick up with your passive sensor? And if so, was there an evolution where people have invented sonar to be like wide band sonar so it's harder to detect? Or what is the feature of that?
So I'm not familiar with us ever detecting pinging from Russians or US or anything, but there was a system developed in the late Cold War. It's called LFAA, Low Frequency Active Agon, where the IUSS would deploy a ship that would send out a 240 decibel ping in an area and then receive it on the acoustic arrays, the SOSUS arrays.
Oh,
but that
so it was like a bistatic?
Bistatic, so the US ship sends a ping, comes back to SOSUS, but it was never fully developed. I don't know the status of it. I believe it's been shelved for use in the wartime. Because 240 decibels is a pretty loud signal if you're a whale.
Right.
Or, yeah, a dolphin.
But that turns your passive ray into kind of
But to answer your question, that's the only active pinging that we were involved in.
Okay.
On the Dallas in the early 80s, we lost, we were high-speed transiting. Your systems told us there was a submarine coming out here in the Philippines. We were transiting all the way across the Indian Ocean at high speed. There was never any contact in the Indian Ocean. And as the contact was coming out, the Russian ships were ahead of it, and they were just throwing depth charges into the water, which acidified the water, and you couldn't, ambient noise was horrific. And by the time everything settled back down, that submarine was long gone. But had he gone active on a ping, we not only had the frequency, we'd have had the exact bearing. We might not have had the range, but we'd have known where he was. And I can't imagine how much sonar and your systems have improved since the early 80s. With the advent of the computer and the miniaturization of our cell phones have more power than our old computer on the boat, which was the size of your desk there. So I'm happy that the military seems to be progressing technology-wise.
And none of us are involved in any of that. There are people in the room that may, but we're not, we're talking about the Cold War. I haven't been involved or had a clearance since 2007, so.
I had an interim top secret, because as a sonar supervisor, you had to know exactly where you were in the ocean, because the bottom type, whether it's rocky, sedimentary, it all affected how your sound would travel in the deep submergence zone, your sound channels, the isovelocity layer, all of that.
Yeah, I would tell you, I only can hope that the people today are as smart as the people were when I came into the Navy, and that they keep this stuff secret and top secret and compartmentalized and don't tell us. I don't think anyone needs to know what the Navy's doing right now with respect to tracking anything.
And to expand on the sonar question a little bit, as you know, Paul, submarines don't want to go active. Most submariners have never used active sonar because it gives you away, right? I mean, we see the World War II movies where the submarines ping, ping, ping. It's not done that way in the real world. Submarines do not go active.
You need the captain's permission. We were under high-speed transit, and we were running into an underwater mountain, and I lost, on the fathometer, I lost the soundings because I was in a range gate expecting a return in a certain area, and it didn't show up. And we kept progressing, and I asked the quartermaster to chart. I said, are we close to those mountains? He said, yes. So we had to get the officer to deck. The captain came running out with control by periscope and said, we need to slow to 1/3 and take an active ping. And then my whole time on board the sub, we did one active ping. So yeah, we're not familiar with one active.
So if you want a recap of today's presentation, just get this book, Blind Man's Bluff. It's not the movie. The Hunt for Red October is not, but get the book, not the movie, because it goes into great detail technically about what we did. In the movie, they took all this good stuff out. They just did the drama.
Howdy. Yeah, I have two questions. The first one's really more of a clarification. I thought you said that it was 10 years before we detected the first submarine, and yet I thought you said that later on we were tracking all 500 submarines. So if I understood correctly, did something change? What changed? What enabled us to go from 0 to 500?
Could you rephrase that question? 10 years from now.
Am I correct that you said that we did not detect any submarines for the first 10 years with this system until 1962?
So 1954, the first NAVFAC went in at Rainy, Puerto Rico. The first Soviet wasn't detected until 1962.
Right. So,
yes.
Okay, so it was 8 years.
We may have, but we were not recognized.
Okay, but then, subsequent to that, we were tracking all 500 of them. What changed? That's my question. That's one question.
It's called low-far-gram analysis, and once we detected one Foxtrot, for example, and it was confirmed by a P3 that acoustic detection, I have a visual contact, we saved those gram cuts, and now we knew. And then it was the same for the Zulu, then it was the same for the November. Once we had that detection, we knew what we were looking for, and that's how that continued.
Okay, well,
the other biggest change was we put the NAVFACs in Adak, Alaska, and Keflavik, Iceland, where the Soviets operated. Now, the Soviets were not operating down in the Atlantic in the early 60s, in the 50s. Their diesel submarines didn't have those kind of ranges in those days. Until the Cuban Missile Crisis, there wasn't really any reason for them to come down. And you got to remember, those submarines were very, very archaic. I don't even know if they were improvements over the German submarines from World War II. And they didn't routinely deploy down here. After Keflavik and Adak went in the 60s, then we were looking at their ports and where they did sea trials. And Jim and I got to see a lot of stuff over the years at Caddy too. Tim Cornett was up there for many years. We watched them operate. We were in their backyard. It was fabulous.
So my second question was this. In 1968, a Soviet submarine went down in the Pacific, and the Russians didn't know where it was, but we did, because we'd gotten apparently acoustic hits. Was that, I think it was maybe the K-129 or something like that?
Yes.
Ballistic missile submarine. Was that a SOSUS hit, or was that some other system that enabled us to pinpoint exactly where that thing was?
No SOSUS.
That was SOSUS, and that was the Glomar Explorer, I believe, that went out and retrieved that submarine and its missiles.
Hi, thank you very much for this presentation. It's fascinating. In 2009, 10 years ago, Air France had an aircraft that went down in the Atlantic, and it took 2-3 months for it to converge on where it was. Can you comment on any instabilities that might have been used? Or it seems like would have made a lot of noise.
If it created a low-frequency noise like an explosion, it perhaps could have been detected, and we would have been asked to look for it. I was not involved at the time. I do know that submarine explosions, we were able to help localize those. Aircraft, just so that you know, we didn't touch on it, turboprop aircraft are also detectable by SOSUS in the deep water. An aircraft transiting over, like a P-3 Orion with turboprops, or the Bear aircraft with the turboprops, if they're transiting in an ocean area, their sound of their propellers will go into the deep sound channel and be detected by SOSUS. So they were easily recognizable to us. So in those cases, in the Norwegian Sea, for example, SOSUS cued the Air Force fighters to go out when those Bear aircraft rounded the North Cape of Norway.
Other questions? Anybody? Yeah.
In September of 1979, there was an alleged nuclear test with the South Africans and the Israelis. Did SOSUS play any role in identifying where that was done and what the possible yields might have been? I think an atomic bomb would make a big noise.
You know, there's another system we're not going to talk about because none of us are cleared for it, that consists of sensors around the world, of nuclear proliferation sensors, whatever the hell they're called. I've never been read into that program, but I know about them. It's probably, well, they've been in the news. You know, the Argentinian submarine that went down, what's it been now, 18 months ago or whatever, that submarine was located by those sensors, the explosion.
Those of us that worked in Keflavik, that picture that I showed you of that facility on the beach, the beautiful, without the palm trees, that one of those buildings was a trailer outside the back door to the NAVFAC. And they didn't have any windows either, we didn't have any windows. They went in a different door than we went in, but some of those guys were Air Force uniformed guys. So we don't know, I mean, they weren't read into what we were doing, we weren't read into what they were doing, but if the United States government has listening posts of any kind, I'm sure that they are monitored. Our last question?
Yes.
A watch officer. Who was a watch officer?
I was a watch officer. I was stationed in the Pacific, Midway and Goosehead NAVFACs in the early 70s. And first, a comment on the training. I think that reading grams is an art as much as it is science. I mean, and years of experience don't necessarily factor into it totally. And I had readers, you know, the first guys that walked the grams, who were really good at reading grams. I mean, they could read it like a book. And they seemed to have that innate ability to do that. And they were the people that, I'm not sure we recognize that ability or make use of it, but they were really national assets, the people that could do that. The second thing is you mentioned Walker, and I can remember in the, I can't remember if it was 73 or 74, it just seemed like everything was dead. And we were tracking Yankees off the coast of the West Coast, and it became really quiet right away. And we had an admiral come to our facility, and I talked to him he asked me about that. I had no clue as to why that happened. So I didn't even hear about Walker until, I guess he was in the 80s.
Yeah, Walker didn't do us any favors. But you know, you gotta also remember, what Walker gave away in a lot of cases, the Russians weren't able to fix. You know, submarines are built. You know, there is no money to go back and totally redesign them and completely silence them. Part of the problem we had in the Atlantic in the 70s, you talk about the same period, was that the submarines moved farther away from the East Coast. And the East Coast NAVFACs were old, the technology was old, the sensors weren't very good, and so the submarines were a little quieter and the arrays were not as good. So we had much more difficult time protecting them. They ultimately moved back in because they realized that the flight time on their missiles was X, and we had that much more time to prepare for them. So, you know, it was a constant thing that they moved out to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge for some years. They moved back in closer to Bermuda, and Jim talked about that toxin. We knew exactly where they were going to be in a small box, depending on their day out of area. And so we absolutely would concentrate our resources on those boxes. We knew exactly where they were going to be, both on the West Coast and on the East Coast. Now, that didn't mean we held them 24/7, we didn't, but we considered what our standard was. If we could get a little bit of contact once an hour or every several hours, I mean, it's not like a submarine can jump out of the water and go 500 knots. They're not going far, particularly at 2 or 3 knots.
So TOPSY, I remember what it stood for. Transiting and Operating Patrols of Soviet Yankees. Transiting, Operating Patrols, Soviet Yankees.
And let's keep that applause going because it's time to relieve these folks of the Q&A. Thank you very much, panel.